Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. Today, I'm joined by Professor Nicholas Giordano, who's the host of the Past Report. Thank you so much for coming on.
Hi, Magdalene. How are you?
I'm good. I wanted to have you on because obviously we have some major education stories happening in the media. There seems to be this sort of groundswell of interest in education on a college level and a K through 12 level. So just to start off, what do you make of all the major changes in the level of parental involvement and the fact that education seems to be something that's really being talked about in politics now?
Well, I think it's about time. I mean, when we look at it, I think the American parents have taken a backseat to their child's education. And I'm talking about for the last couple of decades where they thought the schools were operating in good faith. They believed the teachers were operating in good faith. And so they didn't really get involved in their child's education all that much. Then the coronavirus happened and people were stuck in their houses and children had to do remote learning. And it opened a lot of parents' eyes as to what their kids are actually learning and
Mhm.
what's really going on in the schools. And it's concerning, but they should have known this all the time because it's not like this was something new. It's something that has been talked about by people like myself. It's just that a lot of people didn't pay attention. I understand it. See, parents, when you look at it, it's different than it was back in the 1980s or the 1970s, where you had one parent working, the other parent was home doing the homework with the kids. In today's day and age, both parents are working. By the time they get home, by the time, they serve dinner, they might have to get the kids cleaned up. They don't feel like sitting there and doing homework and all that. And that's why it was a more hands-off approach over the course of the last 2 decades. So it's rapidly changing now. It's evolving.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of parents have been shocked by the standard of curriculum that's being taught, the fact that what they were reading as students is not what their children are reading. In terms of K through 12 education, do you think that when we went into remote learning, there was sort of a fear amongst teachers, or at least in the education system, that their parents might start to become more aware, or is it something that's caught the education system very off guard? Because to me, it seems like teacher unions are shocked that parents are unhappy.
Well, it all depends on the type of teachers you have out there, So there are some really good teachers that are hardworking, and a lot of them don't like the remote stuff because it just simply doesn't work. It's been an abysmal failure, and the students actually know less today than they did pre-COVID levels. I mean, when
Mhm.
you look at how far behind students are, and yet they're just cycling through, they're still getting pushed up to the next grades, even though they didn't learn what they were supposed to learn. But then I think the teachers union were caught by surprise. But it's not a surprise to me that they were so
Right.
shocked that parents could be outraged. They're in their own bubble and they think that everyone thinks like them.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, it's the group think mentality that exists throughout our society. It's plaguing our society. But more importantly, when we look at what the teachers unions and how they're behaving and how they're essentially attacking and demonizing parents, it's because they feel that parents shouldn't have a role. I mean, it's clear
Right.
they don't have a regard for parents' concerns. They feel that they should be able to teach whatever they want and consequences be damned. Well, now parents are getting involved and they don't like being questioned. They're supposed to be the quote unquote professionals and they don't want
Right.
to be questioned. They don't want to be held accountable, but they need to be. What's gone on for far too long, and I want to make it clear to everyone out there that we were having massive problems in our education system prior to the
Yes.
coronavirus, as far as curriculum development, what students were learning, what they can and cannot do. Now it's only metastasized. But when you look at that group think mentality amongst the teachers unions and some teachers that exist out there, it feeds into the whole idea that teachers are teaching students what to think, not
Right.
how to think. And they want those students to be involved in that group think as well.
And you mentioned the fact that students are learning less now than they were prior to COVID. There is a significant learning gap or education gap that's happened in the last 3 years since COVID. Do you see that being addressed anywhere? Because I know a lot of parents are worried about reading levels. They're worried about kids being able to apply to colleges because they don't feel like the grades have been what they would have been. Is there any effort to address that you've seen?
No, because it's a two-tier system essentially, like a lot of other things in our society. So those people with the financial means, the wealthy and the elite of society, They had the money to get tutors. They had the money to
Right.
make sure that their kids didn't fall behind. The students that this hurt the most were the ones that may not have the cohesive family structure in their household. They're the ones that are the most in need in society, where they need the most help, the most guidance, the most discipline. And that's where we see it's fallen off. And once again, these students are just getting pushed through. So they haven't learned the material. Let's say it's a fifth grader going in sixth grade. Well, they didn't learn the material they were supposed to learn in fifth grade
Right.
because one, online learning isn't really education. I mean, I know when my son's school closed down, I mean, I have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old. My son is more interested in what background is showing on his screen and what his friend's background is, as
Right.
opposed to listening to the teacher. So it's not like they absorbed information. A lot of students, this doesn't get discussed at all, but the schools lost track of a lot of students. I mean,
Yeah.
let's face it, some people come from households that aren't in good shape. And there's no one there to make sure that they get online. There's no one there to make sure that they're doing the work. So those students have fell off the guardrails. And this is a problem that we're going to be dealing with for at least the next decade. Now, my students coming to me were already underprepared for college. They were
Right.
underprepared when they got into my course. Unfortunately, that's going to get worse, and we anticipate it, but it's also going to be much more difficult because not only do I have to worry about the academic side of things, now I'm dealing with a variety of social issues as well. I mean, the student body that I'm getting, you can clearly see that they've been isolated for a year and a half. You can clearly see the lack of social interaction throughout that period and how they're having such a difficult time adjusting back into an in-person class setting.
And that's something that's been surprising to me because the Democrats talk quite a bit about mental health. That's something that even conservatives talk about, but there's been no effort to deal with the fact that we have had young people in isolation for over a year or 2 years in some areas. So, in terms of the impact that's going to have on learning, is there any way to fix that? Is there any way to address the type of isolation that's gone on? Because I don't see anything coming down from a federal level.
Okay, so I think there's two ways I want to take it. The first way is I think that all the officials responsible for this disaster need to be held accountable. I think that's the most important thing. Here we are 2 years into COVID, going on our third year, and the amount of damage that has been inflicted on our society that will remain a lot longer than COVID ever did is going to be astounding. So I hope and I pray that we see accountability for what's been done to those, because I couldn't imagine growing up and losing part of my childhood, missing out on the milestones. I mean, I want people to really think about this, especially the adults. We had our milestones.
Right.
And it's easy for an adult to sit there and say, well, we're at this dangerous period. We need to lock everything down, when they already lived their milestones, when they had, the proms, the sweet 16s, the graduations. And yet they're telling these kids that, no, too bad, you're going to have to deal with it. That's
Yeah.
your problem. And it really has taken a toll. Then you look at the increased screen time. I mean, we already knew screen time was bad for kids. Every single study from the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association said screen time is becoming a disaster. It's a real problem. And what did we do? Well, we quadrupled their screen time when we shut everything down. How we help these children get back and into society and be able to interact with other human beings, I don't have the answer to that. And all I know is it's going to be a really difficult problem. So when we're looking at it from that perspective, that's a big issue that I think that it's going to be a lot of work. And we already saw depression and anxiety increasing.
Mhm.
That was already problems. Now it's what, tripled, I think, according to the CDC numbers. It's either doubled or tripled amongst the youth. So we already have that pressure and anxiety increasing. We're seeing increased behavioral issues through schools throughout the country. And their teachers, administrators, school psychological staff, they don't even know how to deal with it at this point. So it's a really dangerous time for the youth.
They don't know how to deal with it at this point. And I just graduated high school when the pandemic really kicked in. And I thought if I had to miss my graduation, my prom, all these major events, I would feel very antagonistic towards education, I think, to even start out going into the end of high school. So because you're teaching people in that age who are really entering adulthood, have you seen a lack of interest in education from people that age? Are kids more fed up? Are they trying to get out of the education system? Or are they so sort of programmed to go deeper into it that it hasn't affected them?
Well, we don't know yet. We don't have that answer. And the reason I say that is because it's still in flux when you look at education. Some days in K through 12, some days are remote, some days aren't.
Right.
And so it's created a problem there. At the higher education level, I know at my college, we're seeing massive problems getting people back onto campus.
Yeah.
And one of the big problems that we're seeing is because, one, we normalize this stupid idea of virtual learning, which isn't learning. And I can't imagine, I mean, listen, most kids 15 to 20 years old are not the most responsible. You want to live life. You're living for the moment in time. You're not always going to be logging on, doing your work, keeping up with the work. You need a lot of self-discipline to be able to do online learning. And most students don't have that ability. But we're seeing in-person enrollment problems. And we don't know if it's because students are afraid because of the pandemic, or it's because of the vaccine mandate. We know there's a lot of pushback with the vaccine mandate. Now, I don't want to even call my governor a governor. She's more like a dictator, Empress Hochul in New York. She is someone that now added a booster shot in order to return to campus. And I know students personally who said, I did everything the government asked. I got the 2 vaccines. I wear my mask. And now they want me to add a booster. I don't want the booster. So I'm going back to online learning. So we don't know if students are actually still into education, if there's going to be a major shift where students are just going to say college isn't even worth it. It's not worth the money and going into debt for. We don't know if that's going to happen. I think the colleges were going to have a problem sooner or later anyway. I think the reckoning was coming for especially the 4-year colleges, the private institutions, given how expensive they are. I think that reckoning has been sped up. And another problem that the higher education institutions has is the changing landscape of the population. We are an aging population. The student body is anticipated to decrease. Our younger generations are decreasing. And so we're going to have less students. So with all the colleges and universities we have, it's going to be a scramble to get students in those seats in order for those colleges to stay open. I think that reckoning is on its way.
And with those type of mandates, that's something that's happening in higher ed, but it's also happening amongst parents who have students in K through 12. There's been a big removal of students and an interest in homeschooling and people homeschooling in person, co-op learning as well. There seems to be a lot of frustration by the teacher unions about that fact. There seems to be a lot of people saying in that this isn't going to be good for students long term. This isn't something that's stable. Do you think that this swell of homeschooling is stable, that parents will be able to teach in a way that maybe online learning from these school districts weren't? Will there be more stability, do you think, if you go into homeschooling in person for younger children?
Well, I think the education system as a whole has been blown up, and I think it has to be rebuilt in some form, some fashion. Now, there are merits to a public education system. I'm constantly hearing people say, well, if you don't like it, just homeschool your kids. That's not an option for a lot of parents, particularly if you come from a single parent household and the person's working 2 or 3 jobs, or a 2-person household and both parents have to work all the time. Homeschooling may not be an option for them. The co-ops would be much better off, but then there's transportation issues. So you do have issues when it comes to homeschooling and co-ops. I do see them continuing to increase. I do see private schools continuing to increase. That's how fed up some people are with the public education system. I mean, listen, you got Baltimore, school districts in Baltimore where only 5% of the students can actually pass tests. Only 5% of the students are actually proficient in the subject material that they're learning. If only 5% of the students are actually proficient, then what the hell are we doing? I mean, what's the point of wasting all these tax dollars? Unfortunately, with the teachers union, it's not that they're really worried about the quality of education with homeschooling and co-ops. It's a threat to their position. It's a threat to their pensions. It's a threat to their tenure and their future security. If public schools don't have bodies in those seats, well, you don't need as many teachers, and
Right.
that's where layoffs come down the pike. So it's self-interest motives by them. And I understand it to a degree. I mean, once again, I'm a pension person. I work for the public institution. So I understand that point. But every family is going to have to make their own decision. However, I will say that our entire education system needs to be rebuilt. And I'm talking from the ground up. We need to start over and rethink public education and where we've gone, because we are essentially teaching students certain things that are completely useless, that will never benefit them in life. And we're not teaching them essentials in life. So, saving, investing, what's compound interest. We're not teaching them the basic structures of this government. And when people think of education, they simply think of math and science and reading. Education plays a core role in developing a good citizen and what it means to be a good citizen. It's what contributes to society. I mean, all those things are important elements that haven't been taught in years.
No, they haven't. There's no classes on how to do taxes when you're in high school, but there are quite a few classes on European history and the French revolutions over and over again. Just switching gears a little bit to the political side of this, obviously in Virginia, I live in Virginia, we saw a governor's race flip for Republicans, the statewide offices here as well, really on the back of the education issue. And this is something that has sort of surprised the Biden administration and Democrats as a whole. Do you see more of that coming in terms of parents leading the charge for their own candidates? Because we haven't really seen parental involvement due to education in the political sector in decades. And now with Virginia, it seems to be that Republicans are willing to meet parents halfway to push more homeschooling or charter schools, whatever they want. And parents are willing to actually campaign for Republicans who want more parental involvement in education.
Absolutely. I mean, I know for a fact that prior to the coronavirus, the attendance at school board, if you got 5 parents
Yeah.
at a school board meeting, that was a lot. And we're talking about, my area, there's districts with like thousands of students. And so really 5 parents are going to show up. Now we're seeing school board meetings packed. Not only are school board meetings packed, there's actually organizations that have now developed parents joining together, whether they're mothers, fathers, doesn't matter. And they're coordinating and organizing attendance, getting the information out there. I mean, most people have no idea when the school board meetings are held or anything. Well, now they do.
Yeah.
And so we see parents pushing back on what the students are learning. We see parents pushing back against mask mandates and their kids being masked up for 6 to 8 hours a day. Parents pushing back against some of the teachers and what they're seeing teachers teach. So, yeah, I do think that people are getting more involved, more and paying attention more. I don't know how the Democrats and President Biden, how they were so surprised. I mean, they were shocked. I don't know how. It was clear once I started seeing the attendance at school board meetings go up, you knew something big was going on. And you will see more parents now challenge the school boards. They're going to run for the school board seats and they're going to run for the local offices. And that's the way you really make change. And unfortunately, what's happened over the course of not just years, but decades, most parents not only took a hands-off approach. I'm talking about now Republicans and conservatives. They completely got out of the public sector. They didn't get involved in the public sector all that much. And what has happened is the liberals, you could go to a deeply red conservative area, but if you look at their school board, it's mostly liberals on there in the deeply red conservative areas that are driving some of the stuff their kids are learning. And it's really shocking. And I think that opened a lot of people's eyes. However, and here's the problem that parents are going to be facing. It's not just the local school boards. It's not like a local school board is going to be developing the curriculum and approving the curriculum. That comes from the state education departments. So it's not just about the local school board. Yeah, I think it's important to get on there, have your voice heard, and you have some influence over the policies and what's going on in that school. But if you really delve into the actual curriculums, a lot of it's coming from the state. And the states are the ones that control the education system. And they're the ones that push this CRT, critical race theory being taught. They push, and it goes by numerous names, diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice, whatever you want to call it. That's coming from the state. And unfortunately, local districts have to adhere to the state when it comes to curriculums and what needs to be taught, because the state holds the money.
Right.
And if the state holds the money, they have the control.
And in that vein, because of the state and federal power there seems to be this desire by the teacher unions, by a lot of people on the left, for the Biden administration to take some sort of action against parents, to fix it for the teacher unions. But I'm not really clear on what that action is. In your opinion, what do teacher unions, what do people on the left want Biden and his administration to do to quell parental outrage? What do they think he can do?
Well, they want him to punish those Americans that speak out. What they want is basically everyone to be labeled the domestic terrorist that goes into a school board and raises their voice. I mean, the whole idea of this domestic terrorism, domestic enemy, and the release of the Department of Justice memo about parents being threat tagged because of what's going on at school board meetings. Listen, I mean, the American people have a right to be angry. Not only do we have a right to be angry, I mean, since when is the public sector and the teachers like the only group that nobody could yell at?
Right.
The only group is the school board that they're not allowed to face any criticism. I mean, it's completely illogical. And when I tell people, when you go and you speak before a school board meeting, I always tell people, be respectful. Don't be an idiot and threaten any type of violence. That's a crime. You're going to get arrested. Local police forces can handle that. They're the ones that are supposed to handle that. But be respectful, but you do have a right to express your anger and frustration. You do have a right to raise your voice. And what a lot of school boards are saying, or the National School Board said, and what the Biden administration is saying, is because you raised your voice, we look at words as violence. Mm-hmm. Not that you made an actual threat. It's the demeanor and how you expressed your thoughts to the school boards that is violent. And therefore, now we may be able to threat tag you as a domestic terrorist. And it's not just with those that are going against school boards. We're seeing this throughout our society. I mean, the Biden administration released a document, the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, right, where it says that anyone that expresses any anti-government or anti-authority sentiment has the potential to be labeled as a domestic terrorist. Now, you'll never find any legal statutes that define what exactly is anti-government, anti-authority sentiment. The only thing you'll be able to find is the FBI, and when it talks about anti-government violent extremism, anti-authority violent extremism, those that want to do harm in order to change policy. Well, now, essentially, the Biden administration has now dropped that standard to just sentiment. So if I'm someone, which you and I have just been criticizing the education system for the last 30 minutes, are we going to be labeled as anti-government, anti-authority sentiment? Are we going to be labeled as domestic terrorists? And it was a clear threat to parents when that Department of Justice memo came out. It was a clear warning to parents to say, hey, back off or else. Unfortunately for them, it had the exact opposite effect. Right. It just made people more angry, and yes, it made people more furious, and they actually spoke out more. And not only did they speak out more, several states have dropped their affiliation with the National School Boards Association over it, because the National School Board Association has become toxic. And now we're learning that the Secretary of Education may have been the one that pushed the National School Board Association to send that letter to the Department of Justice. Now, what is a Secretary of Education? What role do they have where they want parents to be labeled as domestic terrorists, where they want, and there's only one thing I could think of, and it's for the federal government, for the Department of Education, the United States Department of Education, to usurp education out of state and local control and bring it into the federal apparatus fully.
Yeah. And I think if parents become even more aware of that, you might see even more mass unenrollments, and that's something that will cause the Biden administration and Democrats to become even more enraged, and it will escalate and escalate. Just sort of in closing and in sort of the solutions wing of this interview, what can parents do to supplement their child's curriculum, their education? You know, if they're in this online learning situation, which hasn't been well put together, which has sort of been last minute, what can they do to make sure their child is receiving some level of real education at home?
Well, I will say this. So doing homework with children is never fun. I'm someone that is trained to teach college students. So when I was helping my children throughout the pandemic, it wasn't pleasant because I don't know what level a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old, because that's when they were locked down. They were those ages. I don't know what a 6-year-old is supposed to get and what they're supposed to have trouble with. I mean, so something that comes easy to me, I would be like, how don't you understand it? I'm trying to explain to it. So I will say a parent needs patience. That's number one. But as far as supplementing a child's education, you have to look at their textbooks. You have to see what they're learning. Look at the homework they're doing. Talk to them about what they're learning in their classrooms. More importantly, you're also a teacher. People don't realize that, but the
Right.
parents are major teachers as well. And for things like my topic, American government and politics or world politics, you don't need teachers, in a sense, to make your child understand it. You could read the Declaration of Independence with your child. You don't need a textbook to do that. You don't
Right.
need someone else's interpretation of the Declaration of Independence. Read the United States Constitution with your child. And it's simple things like that. Make it an activity. Try and make it fun for the kid. And I think that goes a long way. But parents have to be involved because we now see the results of what happens when parents take a back seat in their children's education.
And parents need to understand that even if we ever do return to normal, that's not an excuse to return to the normal apatheticness of how we've been handling education. Thank you so
Well, I
much.
don't think we're ever returning to
No.
normal when it comes to the education system. I think that the education system has profoundly changed because of this pandemic, and people's views of the education system has profoundly changed. I do think major changes are coming down the pike. Now, I can't tell you what those changes are going to be, but there are a hell of a lot less people that have faith in the educational institutions today than they did prior to the coronavirus.
And it's strange that any politician is still caught off guard by parental anger or upsetment after what everyone's been through the last 3 years. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people follow you on social media?
Well, I'm on Twitter, Getter, and at PAS Report. So you can check me out there. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. And then you could just go to pasreport.com. You'll find links to the podcast there. It's a great podcast. People should check it out.
Yes, it is great. I like it very much. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll link all that below.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.